The library of Ashworth Manor smelled of autumn, of leather and beeswax, of paper aged to the colour of honey, of wood smoke drifting from the great hearth that dominated the eastern wall. Lady Eleanor Hartwell had discovered this sanctuary 3 days after her arrival, when the weight of sympathetic glances and whispered speculation had grown too heavy to bear, and she had fled the breakfast room with some murmured excuse about a headache. The library had welcomed her with its silence, its rows upon rows of books standing like sentinels against the judgment of the world beyond its walls. She had come every day since, arriving earlier each morning, claiming the window seat that overlooked the rolling hills of the estate, wrapping herself in the threadbare shawl that had been her mother's, and losing herself in volumes of poetry and philosophy that demanded nothing of her but attention. She was a widow of modest means, no, she corrected herself with the brutal honesty that sleepless nights encouraged, a widow of no means whatsoever, invited to the Duke of Ashworth's estate party through the charity of a distant cousin who had married well and pitied poorly. The invitation had been a lifeline she could not refuse, though every moment among the other guests reminded her of how far she had fallen, how thoroughly her late husband's debts and indiscretions had tainted her name. They looked at her with curiosity barely disguised as concern, the gentleman with a particular sort of calculation that made her skin crawl, as though widowhood and poverty had rendered her available for arrangements that no respectable woman would entertain. So she hid, and the library kept her secrets. It was from this window seat, on the 4th morning of her refuge, that she first saw the Duke of Ashworth, clearly not across a crowded drawing-room or at the distant head of the dinner table, but alone, astride a great black horse, riding across his estate with a singular focus that seemed to exclude the entire world. Sebastian Thorne, 5th Duke of Ashworth, was a figure of legend even among a society that trafficked in gossip as currency. Cold, formidable, untouchable, a man who had withdrawn from London after some scandal years prior and now ruled his northern estate like a self-appointed exile. The other guests spoke of him in hushed tones of a broken engagement, of accusations never quite spoken aloud but damning nonetheless, of his preference for solitude over society, of his reputation for coldness that bordered on cruelty. Eleanor watched him ride, his dark coat stark against the amber and gold of the autumn landscape, and thought he looked not cruel but alone, profoundly and deliberately alone, and she understood that impulse with a clarity that surprised her. He disappeared into the tree line, and she returned to her book, but the words swam before her eyes, and she found herself wondering what drove a duke to exile, what sorrows hid beneath that severe countenance, and whether he too was hiding in plain sight, seeking sanctuary in the vast emptiness of his own estate. Eleanor's mornings developed a rhythm, a careful choreography designed to avoid notice and thus avoid conversation. She rose before the household stirred, when the corridors were still shadowed and silent, when the servants were only beginning their day and had no time to spare for curious glances at the widow who wandered alone. She would slip down the back staircase, her slippers soundless on stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and enter the library through the lesser door, the one hidden behind a tapestry that she had discovered quite by accident and now used with the possessive familiarity of a creature returning to its den. The morning light that entered through the tall windows was soft at this hour, hesitant, filtering through ancient glass that transformed it into something golden and forgiving. The smell of the library became her comfort, leather and paper, beeswax and wood smoke from the fire that some invisible servant had laid in the night, the faint, dusty scent of pages that held centuries of thoughts and dreams and sorrows not her own. She had claimed her window seat as territory, arranging the cushions just so, keeping her small stack of books on the side table within reach, and it was here, on the 7th morning of her sanctuary, that her solitude was shattered. She did not hear him approach the Duke, moved with a quietness that seemed at odds with his stature, and knew his presence only when his voice, cold and measured and deeply masculine, cut through the silence like a blade. I was not aware the library was in use at this hour. Eleanor started so violently that the book in her lap tumbled to the floor, and she rose with an awkwardness that made her cheeks burn, her curtsy hasty and graceless. "Your Grace, I forgive me. I did not mean to intrude. I shall remove myself at once." "You will do no such thing," he interrupted, and she dared to lift her eyes to his face for the first time since that distant glimpse at dinner. Sebastian Thorne was as severe as his reputation suggested. Dark hair, darker eyes, a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten the shape of a smile, and a bearing that radiated control and distance in equal measure. He regarded her with an expression she could not read, something between annoyance and curiosity, and then bent to retrieve her fallen book, his movements precise. It was then that she saw his hands scarred across the knuckles, a jagged line across the back of his left hand that spoke of old injury, hands that contradicted the image of a man who spent his life in idle, aristocratic pursuits. He held the book for a moment, glanced at the title, then offered it to her without comment. "You may continue to use the library, Lady Hartwell. I ask only that you do not disturb the private study beyond the far door. It is locked, and I prefer it remain so." His tone was formal, dismissive, the words of a man unaccustomed to explaining himself. Eleanor took the book, her fingers trembling slightly, and managed a whispered, "Of course, Your Grace, thank you." He inclined his head, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been mere politeness, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft but definitive click that echoed in the sudden emptiness. Eleanor sank back into her window seat, her heart racing inexplicably, the book clutched to her chest, and realized that her sanctuary had just become infinitely more complicated. Weeks passed, and the library became a shared space divided by an unspoken treaty, neither acknowledged, but both observed with careful precision. Eleanor claimed the mornings, arriving as dawn broke and departing before the household assembled for luncheon, while the Duke worked in his private study during the afternoons, his presence announced only by the faint sound of his footsteps beyond the locked door or the occasional rustle of papers. They passed each other, sometimes in doorways or between the stacks, exchanging brief nods that carried the weight of recognition without the burden of conversation, and Eleanor found herself attuned to his presence in ways she did not quite understand, aware of him even when he was invisible, as though the library held some record of his passage that she alone could read. The household staff, freed by her low status from the usual discretion, gossiped freely in her presence, and she learned fragments of the Duke's history through their whispered conversations. A broken engagement 5 years prior, accusations of cruelty that were never quite specific enough to be refuted, but damning enough to exile him from London society, his choice to withdraw to Ashworth rather than fight rumours that painted him as cold, unfeeling, perhaps even dangerous. The younger maids spoke of him with fearful respect, but the older servants, those who had known him since childhood, defended him with a fierceness that suggested a different truth beneath the gossip, and Eleanor found herself observing him with increasing curiosity, seeking evidence to support one version or the other. It was from her window seat that she conducted her study, watching him move through his days with the focus of a scholar examining a particularly puzzling text. She saw him with his horses, his hands those scarred, capable hands gentle on their necks, as he spoke to them in tones too low to hear but clearly affectionate, saw him pause in his morning rides to speak with his elderly groundskeeper, their conversation unhurried and marked by what appeared to be genuine warmth, saw him stop to examine a struggling tree or redirect a stream that threatened the path, small acts of stewardship that spoke of care rather than coldness. The contradiction between his reputation and her observations intrigued her, troubled her, made her question which version was true or whether both could somehow coexist in the same man, and she began to look for him in the mornings, her reading interrupted by glances toward the window, her attention divided between the words on the page and the solitary figure moving through the landscape below. She began, almost without conscious thought, to leave small signs of her presence in the library, her shawl arranged just so on the window seat, a book left open to a particular passage on the table nearest his study door, a bookmark placed with deliberate care, wondering if he noticed, if he understood these small gestures as the messages they were, evidence that someone saw him, that his sanctuary was not as empty as it appeared, and though he never remarked upon these arrangements, she noticed that her shawl was once carefully folded when she arrived after forgetting it overnight, that the books she left were sometimes moved but always respectfully, always with a care that suggested they had been read, and she understood that he too was watching, observing, conducting his own silent study of the widow who had invaded his solitude and somehow made it less lonely. It happened on a morning when frost had silvered the windows and Eleanor's breath misted in the cold air of the library, the fire not yet built up enough to dispel the night's chill, and she had been searching for a particular volume on the upper shelves, a collection of essays she had glimpsed days before, but not dared to retrieve, given its precarious position on the highest tier. The rolling ladder was older than she was, its wheels protesting softly as she positioned it with care, testing each rung as she climbed, her skirts hampering her progress in a way that made her grateful no one was present to witness her ungraceful ascent. And she had just closed her fingers around the spine of the book when the wheel slipped, the ancient mechanism failing, and the world tilted sickeningly as the ladder swayed away from the shelf. She did not have time to cry out, managed only a sharp intake of breath before gravity claimed her, but the impact she anticipated never came. Instead, there were hands, strong and sure, catching her beneath the arms and around the waist, steadying her against a solid chest as her feet found the floor with an inelegance that would have been mortifying under any other circumstance. For a moment, she could not move, could not think, aware only of the warmth of him, the scent of sandalwood and something else, something distinctly masculine, the sound of his heart beating steadily beneath her ear where her head had landed against his shoulder. And when she finally gathered the courage to look up, she found Sebastian's face mere inches from her own, his dark eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that stole what little breath she had remaining. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, urgent in a way his usual formality never allowed, and his hands remained on her waist as though he did not quite trust her to stand unassisted, and she realized with a sharp shock of awareness that she did not want him to let go, that the coldness she had attributed to him was not coldness at all, but control, an iron discipline that kept something else, something heated and almost desperate, carefully contained, and she could see it now, in his eyes, in the tightness around his mouth, in the way his fingers flexed slightly against her sides, as though resisting the urge to pull her closer. I am well, Your Grace, thank you." She could not seem to complete a sentence, her usual composure scattered like the frost melting on the windows, and he stepped back, releasing her with what appeared to be reluctance, his jaw tight. "What were you reaching for?" The question was ordinary, practical, but his tone carried an undercurrent she did not know how to interpret, and she gestured vaguely toward the upper shelf, unable to find words. He retrieved the book without need of the ladder, his height sufficient to reach what she could not, and held it for a moment, reading the title. "Montaigne," he said, something shifting in his expression, something that might have been approval or surprise or both. "You have excellent taste, Lady Hartwell." It was the first compliment he had paid her, the first acknowledgement that she was more than an inconvenient presence in his library, and emboldened by the lingering warmth of his hands on her waist, by the way he was looking at her as though truly seeing her for the first time, she found her voice. "Have you read him, Your Grace?" He nodded slowly. "Many times. His thoughts on solitude are particularly relevant." The pause before the last word was weighted with meaning, and she understood suddenly that they were not speaking of philosophy at all, but of themselves, of the parallel isolations that had brought them both to this library, to this moment. "If you enjoy Montaigne," he continued, his voice carefully neutral once more, "you might appreciate Don. I have a collection in my study. I shall leave it for you." It was a small offer, but it felt momentous, an opening of a door that had been firmly closed, and Eleanor accepted the book he held with hands that trembled slightly, their fingers brushing in the exchange, the contact brief but electric. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered, and he inclined his head, already turning away, but she saw his hand rise to his chest as he walked toward his study, saw him press it there as though checking that his heart still beat correctly, and she knew that whatever had shifted between them in those moments when he held her was not her imagination, that he had felt it too, this recognition, this impossible and terrifying awareness of another solitary soul. After she left, he stood in the silence of the empty library, still holding the place on the shelf where the book had been, his eyes closed, and when he finally moved, it was to sit heavily in the chair nearest the window where she always read, his head in his hands, and Eleanor, glancing back through the glass of the door she had not quite closed, saw him there and understood with sudden piercing clarity that the Duke of Ashworth was not cold at all, but desperately, achingly lonely, and that she was not the only one who had been hiding in this library, seeking refuge from a world that had judged them both and found them wanting. Autumn deepened around Ashworth, the trees surrendering their green to crimson and gold, and with the turning of the season came a shift in the atmosphere of the library, as though the walls themselves had softened, grown permeable to something neither Eleanor nor Sebastian dared name aloud. Their conversations became more frequent, though they maintained the formal distance of two people circling something too fragile to approach directly, discussing Dante's Circles and Milton's Paradise, debating the merits of Pope's translations and the architecture of Shakespeare's sonnets, never veering into anything resembling the personal, even as their words revealed more than either intended. Eleanor learned, through these careful exchanges, that the Duke read poetry, not merely read it, but loved it with a passion that seemed incongruous with his stern reputation, could quote entire passages from memory, his voice taking on a quality she had never heard when he spoke of Keats or Wordsworth, something unguarded and almost tender that made her chest tighten with an emotion she refused to examine too closely. One rainy afternoon, when the windows wept and the library seemed to exist outside of time entirely, she found a volume of Donne's collected works on her usual table, a place she had not left it, and opening the book, discovered a slip of paper marking a single poem, and written in a hand she was coming to recognize. Elegant, controlled, revealing discipline in every stroke, was a single line: "No man is an island, entire of itself." She sat for a long time holding that paper, reading the line again and again, trying to parse whether it was meant as observation or confession, whether he was speaking to her or to himself or to the solitude they both inhabited. And she was unsure, desperately unsure, whether she dared believe it was an invitation, a reaching across the distance he maintained so carefully. That evening at dinner, seated far down the table, among the other guests of lesser consequence, while Sebastian presided at its head with the remote courtesy that was his public manner, she felt his gaze upon her and looked up to find him watching her across the candlelight and the elaborate centerpieces, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed to strip away all the pretense of the formal gathering. And for a moment the room fell away, the chatter of the other guests fading to meaninglessness, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement perhaps, or a question, or the recognition of a shared secret that neither could voice but both understood. She saw his hand tighten on his wine-glass, saw the muscle in his jaw flex, as though he were holding back words that wanted desperately to be spoken, and then one of the ladies beside him addressed him, and the moment shattered. But Eleanor sat trembling in her chair, her dinner untouched, understanding that whatever had begun between them in the library was no longer contained by those walls, that it was following them into the wider world, demanding recognition, and she was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, knowing that to acknowledge it would be to risk everything: her fragile safety, her sanctuary, her carefully constructed refuge. But to deny it was becoming impossible, for how could she unsee what she had seen in his eyes, or unfeel the way her heart responded to his presence, or pretend that the Duke of Ashworth was still the cold, forbidding figure she had imagined from a distance, when she now knew the truth that lived beneath that careful control, the loneliness that matched her own, the hunger for connection that he buried beneath duty and discipline, but that called to something equally buried in herself. As autumn surrendered to the first whispers of winter, the atmosphere at Ashworth grew heavier, the other guests becoming restless with the changing season, seeking entertainments that would distract from the lengthening shadows and the chill that crept through even the most well-heated rooms, and Eleanor found herself increasingly besieged by invitations. She did not want card games in the drawing room, amateur theatricals, an excursion to the village, all of which she declined with excuses that grew thinner with each repetition, until it became apparent to everyone that Lady Hartwell preferred the solitude of the library to the company of her peers. She did not care what they thought, these people who smiled to her face while whispering about her circumstances behind gloved hands, but she became aware that Sebastian had begun to intervene on her behalf, deflecting the more persistent invitations with a quiet authority that brooked no argument, mentioning in his careful way that Lady Hartwell was engaged in research of a scholarly nature, that she was not to be disturbed, and though he never looked at her directly during these interventions, never acknowledged what he was doing, Eleanor felt the protection of it like a cloak around her shoulders, warming something inside her that had been cold for so very long. It was on an evening when the wind howled against the windows and the guests had gathered in the drawing-room for whist that Baron Wickham, a man whose reputation preceded him in the worst possible ways, cornered Eleanor in the corridor outside the music room, where she had been attempting to pass unnoticed on her way to the safety of her chambers. "Lady Hartwell," he said, his smile oily in the lamplight, his bulk blocking her path in a way that made her heart begin to race with an old familiar fear. "How convenient to find you alone. I've been hoping for a private word." She murmured something about retiring for the evening, tried to step around him, but he shifted to prevent her passage, and his smile widened. "I understand your late husband left you in rather unfortunate circumstances," he continued, his voice dropping to a tone that made her skin crawl. "Debts, I'm told, quite substantial debts, and it occurs to me that a woman in your position might be amenable to an arrangement, a mutually beneficial arrangement. You understand you're still young enough to be pleasing, and I find myself in need of companionship of a certain sort, the discreet sort, and I would be generous, very generous indeed, more generous than you're likely to find elsewhere given your reputation." The words hit her like blows, each one stripping away another layer of the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain, reducing her to exactly what she had feared. The world saw when they looked at her, a woman of questionable virtue, damaged goods, someone whose poverty made her vulnerable to propositions that no respectable lady should ever have to hear. And for a moment, she could not breathe, could not think, could only stand frozen as the Baron's meaning became horrifyingly clear. "I must go," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and this time when she moved to pass him, he let her, but his laughter followed her down the corridor, low and knowing, and she fled, her only thought to reach the library, her sanctuary, the one place in this house where she felt safe, but when she reached the heavy oak door and tried the handle, it would not turn locked. Locked for the first time since she had begun her refuge there, and she stood in the darkened corridor with her hand on the cold brass, fighting back tears, alone with the Baron's words echoing in her mind and no refuge available, unaware that in the shadows at the far end of the hallway, Sebastian stood watching, his face rigid with a fury that would have terrified her had she seen it, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, having witnessed everything, having heard everything, and already calculating exactly what he would do about Baron Wickham come morning. Morning arrived pale and cold, winter announcing itself in the frost that etched patterns on the windows and the breath that misted in the corridors despite the fires burning in every hearth, and Eleanor descended to breakfast with her composure carefully reconstructed, determined that no one would see how Baron Wickham's words had shaken her, how close she had come to shattering entirely in that darkened hallway outside the locked library. But when she entered the breakfast room, she found the atmosphere strange, hushed, the other guests speaking in low tones that ceased when she appeared, and it was Lady Pemberton, one of the kinder matrons, who leaned close as Eleanor took her seat and whispered that Baron Wickham had departed before dawn, summoned urgently by the Duke himself, and asked, though the asking had apparently been more command than request, to remove himself from Ashworth immediately, and though no reason had been given publicly, the staff reported that His Grace's tone had left no room for argument or delay. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for her tea, understanding immediately what had transpired. What Sebastian had done on her behalf, though he had said nothing to her, would likely say nothing, his protection as silent as everything else between them, and she felt something shift inside her chest, a fortress wall, crumbling, because no one had ever defended her before, not her father who had sold her to settle his debts, not her husband who had seen her merely as a piece of property to be used and discarded, not society which judged her for circumstances beyond her control, but Sebastian, the Duke whom everyone called cold and cruel, had seen her distress and acted without hesitation, without seeking gratitude or acknowledgement, simply because it was the right thing to do, because she mattered to him in ways neither of them had voiced aloud. She went to the library as soon as she could escape the breakfast room, needing the sanctuary of those walls more than ever, and found Sebastian already there, standing at the window with his back to the door, his posture rigid with an emotion she could not name. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, his face was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him, dark with concern and something fiercer, something that made her breath catch. "Lady Hartwell," he said, formal as always, but she heard the question underneath, the checking to see if she was well, and she wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat, too large and too revealing, so instead she simply nodded and moved to her usual chair, and he watched her for a long moment before returning his attention to the window, and they sat in silence together, a silence that felt less like distance than like understanding, like the quiet that exists between two people who no longer need words to communicate. Winter deepened around them in the days that followed, the first snow falling on a grey afternoon, while Eleanor sat reading and Sebastian worked at his desk, and she found herself drawn to the window, watching as the flakes transformed the landscape into something pristine and otherworldly. And then she saw him, Sebastian, wrapped in a heavy coat, walking alone across the grounds, his dark figure stark against the white accumulation, moving through the snow-covered garden with a solitude so complete it made her heart ache. She understood then, watching him through glass that might as well have been a wall between different worlds, that he was as isolated as she was, that his coldness was not cruelty but protection, that he had built his fortress just as she had built hers. And in that moment, she made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She would reach out to him, would risk the safety of her sanctuary to bridge the distance between them, would dare to hope that perhaps two people hiding from the world might find in each other a reason to stop hiding, to step into the light together, to be brave enough to be seen. Eleanor's courage manifested first as a trembling in her hands as she stood in Sebastian's study the following afternoon, the book of poetry clutched against her chest like armor, knowing he was out riding and would not return for hours, giving her time to leave this offering and flee before she could lose her nerve entirely. She had chosen the volume carefully, a collection of metaphysical poets, worn leather binding suggesting it had been read many times by previous owners who had also sought meaning in verses about transformation and hope, and she had marked a single passage with a slip of paper, lines by Henry Vaughan, about finding light in the deepest darkness, about how there is in God, some say, a deep but dazzling darkness. And though her hands shook as she placed the book on his desk, precisely centered so he could not miss it, she felt the rightness of the gesture, this reaching out through literature because neither of them seemed able to manage it through speech. Then she fled, her heart racing, and the days that followed were torture, each morning arriving in the library to find no response, no acknowledgement, until she began to fear she had overstepped some invisible boundary, had presumed too much, had revealed too clearly the feelings she was only beginning to acknowledge to herself, and she told herself she had been foolish, that a duke and a penniless widow could never be more than cordial strangers sharing space in a library, that she had mistaken his kindness for something deeper, when it was merely the courtesy any gentleman would extend to a guest in his home. But on the fourth day, when she settled into her usual chair, she found a book waiting for her, not in her hands but placed deliberately on the small table beside her seat, where she could not fail to notice it, and her breath caught as she recognized it as one she had never seen before, a collection of sonnets by various poets. And when she opened it with trembling fingers, she found a passage marked in Shakespeare's hand, Sonnet 116, about love that looks on tempests and is never shaken, about love as an ever-fixed mark. And she sat staring at the words until they blurred before her eyes, understanding that Sebastian was answering her, speaking to her in the only language that felt safe to both of them, and from that day forward, their silent conversation through literature continued, each book a revelation, each marked passage a confession they were too afraid to voice aloud. She left him Keats on beauty and truth, and he responded with Donne on souls that speak without words. She offered him Wordsworth on tranquility, recollected, and he countered with Blake on the courage to forge one's own path. She gave him metaphors, and he returned with declarations barely disguised as verse. And all the while the household staff began to notice that his grace seemed different, lighter somehow, that he smiled now when he thought no one was watching, and his elderly steward remarked to the housekeeper that he had served the Duke since his Grace was a boy, and had never seen him so nearly content, so almost happy, as if some burden he had carried for years was finally lifting. Eleanor knew she was falling in love, had perhaps already fallen, past the point of saving herself, but she reminded herself sternly of reality, each night as she lay in her bed, unable to sleep for thinking of him. She was a widow whose husband had left her nothing but debts and shame. She had no fortune and no prospects. She was living on the Duke's charity, and would have to leave eventually, because she could not impose forever. And Sebastian was a duke, bound by duty and expectation to marry well, to choose a woman whose bloodline and dowry would enhance his position rather than diminish it. and no amount of poetry exchanged in secret could change the fundamental impossibility of their situation, the gulf between their circumstances that could not be bridged by feeling alone, no matter how profound that feeling might be. Winter deepened around Ashworth with a silence that felt almost sacred, the snow falling steadily until the world beyond the estate's windows became a study in white and grey, and as the Christmas season approached, the house guests began departing one by one, returning to their own families and estates, until Eleanor found herself among only a handful remaining, and she knew she should leave as well, should find some distant relation willing to house her, or perhaps accept a position as a companion to some elderly lady, anything rather than continue imposing on the Duke's hospitality when she had nowhere else to go, and no means to reciprocate his generosity. But Sebastian, when she tentatively mentioned departure, had looked at her with an expression she could not quite read and said simply, "You are welcome to remain as long as you wish, Lady Hartwell. This is your home for the season." And though the words were formal, his tone carried something deeper, something that made her heart clench with hope and fear in equal measure. And so she stayed, telling herself it was only until after Christmas, only until the weather improved, only until she could bear to leave the library and the man who haunted it as surely as she did. The evening came unexpectedly, as transformations often do, arriving on an ordinary day that had given no warning it would change everything. Eleanor was alone in the library as darkness fell early the way it did in deep winter, the fire burning low and casting dancing shadows across the shelves, and she had just risen to add another log when she heard the door open and turned to find Sebastian entering. And something in his bearing was different. His usual rigid control loosened slightly, and she realized he had been drinking, not to excess but enough to lower the walls he kept so carefully maintained between them. "Lady Hartwell," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual, carrying an edge she had never heard before. "Eleanor, why do you hide here?" The directness of the question, the use of her given name, startled her into stillness, and she felt her practiced deflections rising automatically to her lips, some light comment about loving books, about the peace of the library, about needing quiet. But he crossed the room toward her, and she saw in his eyes that he would accept no evasions tonight, that something had broken in him or broken through, and he asked again, softer this time, "Why do you hide?" And the gentleness in his tone, so at odds with his fearsome reputation, undid her completely. She tried to deflect, to turn the question aside, but he persisted with a patience that was somehow more devastating than demand would have been, standing close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could smell the whiskey on his breath mixed with the cedar and smoke scent that clung to him. And finally, her voice breaking, the words came tumbling out, the truth she had guarded so carefully, the shame she had carried alone. Her marriage had been arranged to settle her father's gambling debts. She had been sold, essentially, given to a man 30 years her senior, who had wanted a young wife to display and use and discard, who had been neither kind nor cruel, but simply indifferent, who had left her nothing when he died except debts and the contempt of a society that blamed her for his failures, that whispered she must have been grasping or manipulative, or worse, to have married so far above her station, and she had nowhere to go and no one to defend her, and she was so tired, so endlessly tired, of being judged for circumstances beyond her control, of being seen as something she was not, of hiding herself away because the world was too harsh and too quick to condemn. Sebastian listened without interruption, his face grave in the firelight, and when she finished, her voice barely a whisper, tears streaming down her face, though she tried desperately to contain them, he stepped closer still and said with absolute conviction, "You are not what they say you are." And in those 8 words, Eleanor felt something in her chest crack open, felt the first true warmth she had known in years seep into the frozen places of her heart, felt the beginning of hope that perhaps, impossibly, she might be seen not as the world saw her but as she truly was. The crisis arrived 3 days before Christmas in the form of the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, Sebastian's mother, whose carriage swept up the snow-covered drive with a presumption that spoke of decades wielding social power, and Eleanor, watching from the library window as footmen scrambled to attend the unexpected arrival, felt her brief moment of hope crystallize into ice in her chest, understanding instinctively that whatever fragile understanding she and Sebastian had reached the previous evening was about to be tested in ways neither of them was prepared for. The dowager was formidable in the way only women of her generation and station could be, steel wrapped in silk, cruelty disguised as concern, and she had brought with her a young woman whom Eleanor recognized instantly as Lady Penelope Weatherby, daughter of an earl, possessed of both impeccable bloodlines and a substantial dowry, exactly the sort of match a duke's mother would orchestrate for her son. And Eleanor stood frozen at the window as Sebastian emerged from the stables to greet them, watched as the dowager presented Lady Penelope with a flourish that suggested ownership already established, and even from this distance, Eleanor could see the tension in Sebastian's shoulders. The careful blankness of his expression that she had learned meant he was exercising iron control over some powerful emotion. She did not go down to greet the arrivals, knowing without being told that her presence would not be welcome, and indeed, when the household assembled for tea that afternoon, the dowager's eyes passed over Eleanor with the kind of dismissive coldness that required more effort than simple ignorance. This was deliberate erasure, a cutting designed to wound, and when Eleanor was introduced as Lady Hartwell, a widow who had been a guest for the season, the dowager's smile was all teeth and no warmth as she said, "How charitable of you, Sebastian, to open your home to those in unfortunate circumstances." The word unfortunate delivered with surgical precision to draw blood, and Eleanor felt her face heat with shame even as she maintained her composure, years of society training allowing her to smile and murmur appropriate pleasantries while dying inside. Lady Penelope herself seemed kind enough, if somewhat vapid, talking brightly about London society and the upcoming season, clearly having no idea she was being maneuvered into a match, and the dowager dominated the conversation with talk of bloodlines and duty, of maintaining one's position, of the responsibilities that came with being a duke, and every word was aimed like an arrow at Eleanor, reminding her without stating it directly that she was a charity case, a woman of questionable circumstance, someone with nothing to offer a man of Sebastian's station, except perhaps scandal and social diminishment. Sebastian said little, his jaw tight, his hands gripping his teacup with enough force that Eleanor feared it would shatter, but he did not contradict his mother, did not defend Eleanor, and she understood with sinking certainty that whatever had passed between them in the library had been a beautiful aberration, a moment stolen from reality that could not survive the harsh light of duty and expectation, and she was a fool to have hoped otherwise, a fool to have revealed her heart to a man who could never truly choose her over the weight of his obligations. That evening she began making plans to leave, drafting letters to distant relations in her mind, calculating how long her meager savings would sustain her, trying to determine where in England she might go, where no one knew her story, and she could perhaps find peace in obscurity. And she told herself firmly that she had been foolish to hope, that she had known from the beginning the impossibility of her situation, that she should be grateful for the months of sanctuary the Duke had provided, rather than bitter about the ending she should have anticipated from the start. But knowing all this did nothing to ease the ache in her chest, the feeling that something precious had been offered and then snatched away before she could fully grasp it, leaving her more bereft than if she had never glimpsed the possibility at all. Eleanor avoided the library for 3 days, telling herself it was the only sensible course, the only way to protect what remained of her dignity, and she kept to her rooms as much as propriety allowed, pleading a headache when invited to join the other guests for activities, watching from her window as the dowager orchestrated what seemed to be a courtship between Sebastian and Lady Penelope, the two of them walking the snow-covered gardens with the dowager trailing at a careful distance, close enough to chaperone but far enough to suggest intimacy, and Eleanor forced herself to look away, to accept what she should have known from the beginning, that the library had been a sanctuary and nothing more, that whatever understanding she and Sebastian had reached could not survive the weight of his obligations, that dukes did not marry penniless widows, no matter what tender words were spoken in firelight. On the 3rd day, as winter twilight fell early and cold across the estate, Eleanor found a note slipped under her door, the handwriting achingly familiar from the books they had exchanged. "You are missed in the library. S." She stood holding the paper until her hands trembled, reading those 5 words over and over, searching for hidden meaning, for some indication of what he wanted from her, whether this was kindness or cruelty, invitation or farewell. But the words revealed nothing beyond their surface, and she could not bring herself to respond, could not bear to return to that space that had become so precious, only to watch it transformed into a place where he courted another woman, where the future Duchess of Ashworth would be displayed and approved by his formidable mother. That evening at dinner, the Dowager was particularly effusive, dominating the conversation with talk of the upcoming season of balls and presentations. And then, as dessert was served, she made her announcement with the satisfaction of a general claiming victory. Plans were being made for a ball after Christmas, a celebration of the understanding that had been reached between her son and Lady Penelope. Nothing formal yet, of course, but it was only a matter of time before an official betrothal. And wasn't it wonderful that Sebastian had finally accepted his duty to his name and position? Eleanor kept her eyes on her plate, willing herself to show nothing, to be the perfect picture of polite disinterest, but she could feel Sebastian's gaze on her face, could sense the tension radiating from him at the head of the table, and when she finally dared to glance in his direction, she saw that his face remained impassive as marble, but his hands were clenched so tightly around his fork and knife that his knuckles had gone white, and Lady Penelope looked confused and uncomfortable, opening her mouth as if to speak before thinking better of it, and the Dowager continued talking as if she had orchestrated something magnificent rather than destroyed something precious. After dinner, Eleanor fled, bypassing the drawing room where the ladies were gathering, ignoring the pointed looks and whispered comments, climbing the stairs to her room with the intention of packing, of leaving at first light, regardless of weather or destination. But as she passed the corridor that led to the library, she found her feet carrying her there instead, drawn by a need she could not articulate, a desire to say goodbye to the place that had sheltered her, to the sanctuary where she had, for a brief and beautiful moment, believed she might be allowed to stop hiding and simply be seen. Eleanor entered the library in darkness, carrying only a single candle whose flame wavered with each step, casting shadows that danced across the familiar shelves like ghosts of all the hours she had spent here, and she did not bother lighting the lamps because this was meant to be a farewell, and farewells should be conducted in half-light, in the gentle obscurity that made such things bearable. She moved through the space as one moves through a cathedral, with reverence and sorrow, running her fingers along the spines of books that had become friends, touching the chair where she had spent so many mornings lost in other worlds, pausing at the window where she had first watched Sebastian walking alone through snow and recognized in him a loneliness that mirrored her own, and she whispered goodbye to the room itself, to the sanctuary that had sheltered her when she had nowhere else to hide, to the place where she had, against all wisdom and self-protection, allowed herself to hope for something more than mere survival. The leather and beeswax smell that had become as familiar as breathing seemed more poignant tonight, each sensory detail cutting into her with the sharp edge of loss, and she told herself firmly that she had been grateful for this refuge, that she would carry the memory of these months like a treasure, even as she returned to whatever uncertain future awaited a penniless widow with no connections and a tarnished name. And she was so lost in her silent farewell that she did not hear the door open behind her, did not hear the quiet click of the lock turning, did not sense another presence in the room until Sebastian's voice came from the darkness, low and rough with some emotion she could not name. "Were you going to leave without saying goodbye?" She turned so quickly her candle nearly guttered out, her heart leaping into her throat, and there he was, standing by the door with his shoulders blocking what little light came from the corridor, and even in the darkness she could see he held something in his hand. The key, she realized, the key to the library, and his expression was unreadable. All planes and shadows, dangerous and beautiful, and utterly focused on her face. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, her mind racing through explanations and excuses, anything to maintain the dignity she had, so little of remaining. "I did not expect I thought you would be." But she could not finish the sentence, could not speak the words with Lady Penelope, because they would reveal too much of the pain she was trying so desperately to conceal. He moved then, not toward her but sideways, to one of the library's lamps, and lit it with methodical precision, his movements controlled but somehow conveying a tightly leashed tension, and as warm light filled the space between them, she saw his face clearly, and what she read there made her breath catch. This was not the impassive duke who had sat through dinner while his mother planned his future. This was not the careful gentleman who had maintained such scrupulous distance for months. This was something else entirely, something raw and decided and slightly wild. "No one will disturb us now," he said, holding up the key before slipping it into his pocket, and his eyes never left hers, dark and intense, and filled with an intention she could not interpret, but that made her pulse race, made her acutely aware that they were alone, truly alone, locked away from the household and all its expectations and judgments, and the confrontation she had been avoiding, the conversation she could not bear to have, had finally, inevitably, arrived. "Why have you been avoiding me?" Sebastian's voice cut through the space between them, low and edged with something that might have been anger or hurt or both, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack under the weight of that question, under the intensity of his gaze that seemed to see through every defense she had erected in the past 3 days. "I have not been," she began, but he moved then, taking 3 swift steps toward her before stopping, as if restraining himself, as if the control he was famous for was costing him dearly in this moment. "Do not," he said, and his voice was rough now, stripped of its usual measured cadence. "Do not offer me polite evasions. Eleanor, not here, not in this room where we have been more honest with each other than either of us has been with the world." She drew a shaking breath, trying to find solid ground, trying to remember all the reasons she had resolved to maintain distance. "Your understanding with Lady Penelope," she managed, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "It would not be appropriate for me to—" "There is no understanding," he interrupted, and now there was definitely anger in his voice, sharp and clean as a blade. "There is nothing between myself and Lady Penelope except my mother's presumption and her damned orchestrations." Eleanor stared at him, wanting desperately to believe but afraid of her own hope, afraid of misunderstanding, and he must have seen something of that fear in her face, because his expression softened fractionally even as his hands clenched at his sides. "I have spent months," he said, moving closer again, his voice dropping to something almost confessional, "trying to be the gentleman I thought you deserved, respectful, patient, proper, maintaining distance, even when every instinct demanded I close it, speaking in careful formalities, when I wanted to tell you truths I have told no one." He stopped an arm's length away, near enough now that she could see the fine tension in his jaw, the way his breathing had become slightly uneven. "I wanted to be selfless," he continued, "to give you time, to let you choose freely without the weight of my position or my desire influencing you. But I find I am not as noble as I pretended to be, Eleanor, because what I want is to be selfish." The words hung between them, dangerous and thrilling, and Eleanor felt her heart beating so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "You haunt this library," Sebastian said, his voice gone quiet now, intimate, the tone he might use for confession or prayer. "You haunt me, and I find I will not stand by while you disappear from my life as if these months meant nothing, as if I have not come to depend on your presence like I depend on breathing." She was trembling now, her hands clasped together to keep them steady, her mind racing through his words and finding in them an answer to questions she had not dared to ask. "Why did you lock the door?" she whispered, and something flared in his eyes, something that made her breath catch. "Because I am tired of being interrupted," he said simply, and took another step closer. "Because every conversation we have had has been cut short by propriety or duty or the demands of others. Because for once, just once, I wanted to speak to you without the world intruding." He paused, then added more softly, "Because I was afraid you would run before I could tell you what you have come to mean to me." Sebastian drew a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him, from a place where truths had been locked away for so long they had almost calcified into silence, and when he spoke again his voice carried the weight of confession, of a story he had told no one because no one had cared to listen past the rumors that had shaped his reputation. "My engagement," he began, his eyes never leaving hers, though she could see the cost of holding that gaze, "ended not because I was cruel, but because I refused to marry without affection, without at least the possibility of something real between two people who would spend their lives together." He paused, his jaw tightening with remembered pain. Lady Catherine was beautiful, accomplished, everything society deemed appropriate for a duchess, and she expected our marriage to be one of convenience and mutual indifference, an arrangement that would give her a title and me an heir and nothing more. But I could not, his voice roughened, I could not bear the thought of that emptiness, that pretense, and when I told her I wished to wait, to see if genuine regard might develop between us, she was humiliated, furious that I would question what she saw as a perfect arrangement. Eleanor listened, scarcely breathing, understanding dawning like painful light. She spread rumors, Sebastian continued, told society I had been cold to her, cruel in ways she left to imagination, and I could have fought back, could have revealed her true nature, but what would that have accomplished except to ruin her prospects entirely? He shook his head slowly. So I retreated, accepted society's judgment, chose isolation over a battle that would destroy us both, and I told myself it was better this way, better to be alone than to live a lie. He took a step closer to Eleanor, his voice dropping to something raw and intimate. Until you, he said simply, until I found you here, hiding as I was hiding, and began to understand that isolation is not the same as peace, that protecting oneself from pain also means closing oneself off from everything else. His eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her tremble. You see me, he said, and the words were almost wondering, as if he still could not quite believe them. Not the Duke, with his title and his wealth and his reputation, not the cold man society has decided I am, but me, Sebastian, the man who reads poetry in secret and stands at windows watching snowfall, and has been so lonely for so long, he had almost forgotten what connection felt like. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, felt something breaking open in her chest, all the careful walls she had built crumbling under the weight of his honesty and her own desperate need to match it. My marriage, she whispered, her voice shaking but steady enough to carry truth, was arranged to cover my father's gambling debts, a transaction where I was the payment for his mistakes, and my husband was not kind. Sebastian, he was not. She had to stop, had to breathe through the memories that still carried the power to wound. He was cold and dismissive, and made it clear I was a disappointment, a burden he had taken on for the money my father's creditors paid him to assume the debts along with the wife. She saw Sebastian's hands clench, saw fury flash across his face on her behalf, but she pressed on, needing him to know all of it. His death left me free but penniless, with nothing but a tarnished name and society's judgment that I must have been at fault somehow, that a better wife would have inspired better treatment, and I have been hiding from that judgment, from the world that looks at me and sees only failure and shame and a woman alone with no protection or prospects. She lifted her eyes to his, saw him through the blur of tears and found his gaze unwavering, accepting, full of something that might have been tenderness or rage or both. I see you too, she whispered, the words a vow and a revelation. I see you, Sebastian, and you are not what they say you are. You are not cold or cruel. You are careful and kind and so deeply good, it makes my heart ache. The distance between them seemed both vast and non-existent, a space measured not in physical inches, but in years of loneliness and fear. And when Sebastian lifted his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, Eleanor found she could not move, could not breathe, could only watch as his scarred fingers rose toward her face with a tenderness that made her eyes burn with fresh tears. May I? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and she nodded because words had deserted her entirely, and then his palm was cradling her cheek with such careful reverence she thought she might shatter from the sweetness of it, from the simple, devastating fact that this powerful man was asking permission to touch her as if she were something precious rather than the damaged, debt-ridden widow society had dismissed. I am not a man of poetry and speech, Sebastian said, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Only in writing, and even then I struggle to find words adequate to what I feel, to what you have awakened in me these past months. Eleanor turned her face into his palm, pressing a kiss there that made his breath catch audibly. Your actions have been poetry enough, she whispered against his skin. Every book you left for me, every moment you stood between me and society's cruelty, every time you looked at me as if I mattered, Sebastian, you have been writing me love poems in everything you do. Something broke in his expression then, some final restraint giving way, and he drew her closer with his other hand settling at her waist, pulling her against him until she could feel the rapid beating of his heart through the layers of fabric between them. Eleanor, he said, and then her name again, as if it were a prayer or a plea, and she rose on her toes at the same moment he lowered his head, and their lips met in a kiss that began tender and tentative, a question both were asking and answering simultaneously. The gentleness lasted only a moment before something deeper surged between them, years of isolation, seeking connection, loneliness, reaching for its mirror, Two people who had learned to protect themselves through distance, suddenly discovering that closeness could be its own kind of salvation. Eleanor's hands found their way to his shoulders, then into his hair, and Sebastian made a sound low in his throat that was pure need, pure relief, his arms tightening around her as the kiss deepened into something that felt like homecoming and awakening at once. When they finally parted, both trembling and breathless, Eleanor could see herself reflected in his eyes, not as the world saw her but as he did, precious and desired, and worth choosing, despite every obstacle society might place in their path. "Stay," Sebastian said, his voice rough with emotion, his forehead resting against hers. "Stay not as my guest, not as a refugee in my library, but as my future duchess, as my wife, as the woman I choose above all others." Fear flickered through Eleanor's chest, old and familiar. "Your mother," she began, but he silenced her with a finger against her lips. "Will learn to accept it or will find herself unwelcome in our home," he said firmly, then took both her hands in his, holding them against his chest where she could feel his heart still racing. "What of society, their judgments, the scandal?" She tried again, because she needed him to understand what he would be sacrificing, but Sebastian shook his head, his grip on her hands tightening. "Let them talk," he said, and there was steel beneath the tenderness in his voice now, the determination of a man who had made his choice and would not be swayed. "I have lived in their silence long enough, Eleanor, exiled myself to avoid their censure, shaped my entire life around their good opinion, and what has it brought me except emptiness and loneliness and years of pretending not to feel?" He pulled her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles one by one. "I choose you," he said against her skin. "I choose us, and whatever consequences follow, we will face them together, and I swear to you that you will never hide again, never apologize for existing, never be made to feel less than the remarkable woman you are." The morning arrived with a pale winter sun that did little to warm the frost-covered grounds, and Eleanor woke in her chamber with the memory of Sebastian's kiss still burning on her lips and his promise, "I choose you," echoing in her mind like a vow that seemed too precious to be real, too fragile to survive the harsh light of day and the inevitable confrontation with his mother, the formidable dowager duchess whose disapproval had been as cold and cutting as the winter wind. Eleanor dressed with trembling hands, uncertain whether she should seek Sebastian out or wait for him to come to her, uncertain of everything except the fact that she loved him, and that love, however new and tender, had given her a courage she had not possessed before, a willingness to fight for what they had found together in the sanctuary of his library. She did not have to wait long. Word spread through the household with the peculiar efficiency of servants who observed everything and judged little, and by mid-morning Eleanor learned from her maid, a kind girl named Mary, who had shown her nothing but gentleness, that his Grace had requested a private audience with the dowager in his study, that voices had been raised, that the confrontation everyone had sensed building had finally broken like a storm. Eleanor was not present for the battle, was deliberately excluded as Sebastian faced his mother alone, but Mary brought her details later, whispered accounts pieced together from what the footmen had heard through the heavy oak door. The dowager had been furious, her voice rising in outrage as she demanded to know how Sebastian could even consider such an unsuitable match, a penniless widow with a tarnished reputation and debts that followed her like shadows, when Lady Penelope was everything a duchess should be, well-bred, wealthy, biddable, appropriate. Sebastian's responses had been quieter but immovable, each word apparently delivered with the cold precision of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed by manipulation or maternal guilt, and when the dowager had threatened social ruin, had predicted that society would turn against them both, that his choice would disgrace the family name. Sebastian had reportedly said, with devastating calm, that Lady Eleanor Hartwell was to be his duchess, that if his mother could not accept this with grace and welcome Eleanor as her daughter, she was free to return to London and consider herself no longer welcome at Ashworth. The household had apparently gone silent after that pronouncement, the footmen exchanging wide-eyed glances as the dowager, unaccustomed to defiance from her son, had sputtered protests that fell on stone, and within hours she had ordered her belongings packed, her carriage prepared, her departure arrangements made with the tight-lipped fury of a woman who had lost a battle she had assumed already won. Lady Penelope, Mary reported with something like admiration, had sought private audience with the dowager, and confessed she had never wanted the match, that she had been relieved when Sebastian showed no interest in courting her, that she wished his Grace and Lady Eleanor every happiness, which had only further enraged the dowager, who departed predicting disaster and ruin, her carriage disappearing down the frost-covered drive like a dark portent. Sebastian found Eleanor in the library that afternoon, standing at the window watching the empty drive where his mother's carriage had vanished, and when she turned to him, she saw exhaustion in his face but also peace, a lightness that suggested a burden lifted. And before she could speak, he crossed to her and took both her hands, telling her everything, holding nothing back, and Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the simple, devastating fact that he had chosen her over his mother's approval, over society's expectations, over the easier path. "No one has ever chosen me," she whispered, the words breaking. "Not over convenience, not over duty, not over anything." And Sebastian drew her into his arms, holding her as she wept against his chest, and when her tears finally subsided, he took her face in his scarred hands and told her he had something to ask her properly, formally, in the way she deserved. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a ring, his grandmother's ring. He explained, sapphires and diamonds set in gold, a family heirloom. His mother would be furious to know he was bestowing on Eleanor, and he knelt before her in the library, where they had found each other, surrounded by books and winter light, and asked her to be his duchess, his wife, his partner in facing whatever society and scandal might bring. Eleanor's vision blurred with fresh tears as she said yes, as she felt him slide the ring onto her finger where it settled like a promise, like an anchor, like proof that she was no longer hiding but choosing, no longer afraid but loved. Months later, when spring arrived and transformed the frost-bound grounds of Ashworth into something alive with colour and promise, Eleanor found herself navigating a transformation of her own, from hiding widow to duchess, to be a journey that would have been impossible without Sebastian's steady presence at her side, his hand always reaching for hers when society's judgment threatened to overwhelm her courage. The wedding preparations unfolded through March and into April, and Eleanor discovered that the world beyond Ashworth was not uniformly cruel. Some of society did indeed scorn their match, whispering behind fans about the penniless widow who had ensnared a duke, but others perhaps recognizing something genuine in the way Sebastian looked at his intended, or perhaps simply tired of loveless matches made for property and position, warmed to them with surprising enthusiasm, and Eleanor learned to distinguish between those whose opinions mattered and those whose cruelty revealed more about their own unhappiness than about her worth. Sebastian surprised her daily with the depth of his romanticism, a tenderness he had kept hidden beneath years of careful control, but now expressed with increasing freedom. She would find love notes tucked into books throughout the library, each one containing a line of poetry or simply her name, written in his distinctive hand, as if he needed to practice claiming her, to make real, through repetition, what still felt like a dream. He took her, riding across the estate at dawn, when the world was still soft, with mist and possibility, showed her the hidden corners of Ashworth that he had explored in his years of isolation, a grove of ancient oaks, where bluebells carpeted the ground in spring, a stream where he had spent afternoons as a boy trying to escape his father's expectations, a hill from which one could see 3 counties and feel both the weight and the freedom of the land that was his responsibility and inheritance. Eleanor bloomed under his attention and protection like something that had been kept too long in darkness, finally brought into sunlight, her confidence growing not because Sebastian made her feel safe from the world's judgment, but because he made her feel worthy of fighting against it, worthy of taking up space and speaking her mind, and becoming the kind of duchess who would be remembered not for her birth or her fortune, but for her compassion and her courage. The library remained their private sanctuary even as the household bustled with wedding preparations, a place where they could retreat from the demands of society and simply be Eleanor and Sebastian rather than Lady Hartwell and the Duke. And one morning in early April, the wedding mere days away, she found him there, among the books that had witnessed their entire courtship, and told him, with tears in her eyes and wonder in her voice, that she had never been happier, that she had not known happiness like this was possible for someone like her. Sebastian had pulled her into his arms, held her as if she were infinitely precious, and confessed in a voice rough with emotion that he felt the same, that she had given him back not just happiness but hope, not just love but the belief that he deserved it, that they deserved it together. They married in the estate's chapel on a brilliant April afternoon, with spring flowers, daffodils, and early roses and branches of apple blossom filling the small space with fragrance and color. And when Sebastian lifted Eleanor's veil and saw tears streaming down her face, he whispered that she need never hide again, and she whispered back that she had no intention of hiding when she had him to stand beside, and their kiss was witnessed by those who loved them and blessed by a future that suddenly seemed boundless with possibility. 3 years passed, and with them came a transformation so complete that sometimes Eleanor, now the Duchess of Ashworth in truth as well as title, would catch her reflection in the library windows and marvel at the woman she had become, no longer hunched with shame or hiding in the margins, but standing tall, moving through the world with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from being truly known and truly loved. The Duke and Duchess of Ashworth had become known throughout the county and beyond for something rare in their elevated circles: genuine happiness, a partnership that went deeper than duty or convenience, and their estate had flourished under their joint stewardship in ways that surprised even those who had initially predicted disaster. Together they had restored Ashworth's crumbling east wing, had opened the great library, once Sebastian's fortress of isolation and Eleanor's hiding place, to local scholars and the sons of tenant farmers who showed intellectual promise, had established a fund for widows in difficult circumstances, a cause Eleanor championed with the passion of someone who remembered all too well what it meant to be vulnerable and alone. The whispers that had once followed them, the scandalous match, the penniless widow, the cold duke, had faded into something warmer, stories of the Duchess who remembered everyone's names, and the Duke who had softened into someone capable of laughter. And if some of London society still sniffed with disapproval, Eleanor had learned that their judgment held no power over a happiness built on truth and choice. Sebastian, for his part, had been revealed in his element, no longer isolated, but beloved by those who worked his land, respected by neighboring families who had once feared his sternness, transformed by love into someone who smiled freely and spoke with warmth and proved that reputation and reality need not align. They had a daughter, Catherine Rose, named for both their mothers, in an act of hope and reconciliation, born in the 2nd year of their marriage during an unseasonably warm September, and Eleanor had wept when Sebastian placed their child in her arms, had seen in his scarred hands cradling that tiny perfect being the final proof that gentleness had always lived beneath his guarded exterior. On an autumn afternoon, much like the one when Eleanor had first arrived at Ashworth seeking nothing more than refuge and books, she returned to the library, their library, and found Sebastian seated in the leather chair by the window where he had once worked in solitude, their daughter, now 3 years old, nestled on his lap as he read to her from a book of fairy tales, his deep voice, soft and patient, Catherine's small hand resting trustingly on his chest. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching them, her heart so full it ached with the weight of gratitude and wonder, and when Sebastian looked up and caught her gaze, the smile he gave her contained the whole history of their love, the fear and the courage, the hiding and the revealing, the locked door that had changed everything, the library that had once been her sanctuary from the world's judgment and his fortress against its cruelty had become something entirely different, not a hiding place but a home, not a refuge from life but the very heart of it. And as Catherine laughed at something in the story and Sebastian caught Eleanor's eye again with an expression of such profound contentment, Eleanor understood that their love had not simply saved them, but had transformed the very spaces they inhabited, had turned isolation into connection and fear into joy. That evening, after Catherine had been put to bed, a ritual they shared, taking turns with stories and songs, Sebastian's deep voice surprisingly gentle with lullabies. He claimed not to remember learning. They returned to the library as they so often did, when the house had settled into quietness and the demands of the day had released them, back to each other, and Eleanor found herself drawn to the window where she had once stood watching Sebastian walk alone through the first snow, that image of isolation that had broken her heart and given her the courage to reach out to him through books and poetry when words seemed too dangerous. Now they stood together at that same window, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder, and the autumn darkness beyond the glass reflected their joined silhouettes back at them like a promise kept. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Eleanor asked softly, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. "If I had chosen a different estate to visit that season, if I had not sought refuge in your library, if I had been braver or more foolish and faced society's judgment elsewhere. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, and she felt rather than saw his contemplation, the way he considered questions seriously before answering, one of the 1,000 small things she had learned to love about him. "I think about it often," he admitted finally. "How close we came to missing each other entirely. How many small choices led to that first morning when I found you here and was too much a coward to admit I was grateful for the intrusion." He turned her gently to face him, his scarred hands she now knew had been injured, saving a stable boy from a fire, another truth hidden beneath rumors, cradling her face with infinite tenderness. "I think about the courage it took for you to stay when everything in your experience told you to run, to hide, to protect yourself. I think about that night when I locked the door because I could not bear to lose you without fighting for you, and how terrified I was that you would reject me, that I had misread everything between us." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, the good kind, the kind that came from being understood so completely that even fear could be shared without shame. "We almost missed each other," she whispered. "We were both so afraid, so convinced we were unworthy of love." They stood together as evening deepened into night, and when Sebastian asked her, as he still did sometimes, as if he needed reassurance that their happiness was real and enduring, whether she was truly happy, Eleanor thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived at Ashworth, ashamed, hiding, convinced that safety meant invisibility, and that she deserved nothing more than the margins of other people's lives. "I never knew happiness was possible until you," she told him, the words inadequate but true. "Not just happiness, but this being known completely and loved anyway, being seen in all my fear and failure and chosen regardless. You taught me that hiding is not the same as safety, that vulnerability is not weakness but the greatest courage." Sebastian kissed her then, soft and deep, and in that kiss was the history of their love. Every book exchanged, every stolen glance, every risk taken, every wall slowly dismantled until two isolated souls found themselves not alone, but inexplicably, impossibly together. Later, much later, when the fire in the library hearth had burned low and the candles had guttered to soft glowing pools of wax, Sebastian and Eleanor remained together in their sanctuary, and he drew her to the ancient leather sofa where they had shared so many conversations, first tentative and formal, later intimate and unguarded, and they sat in companionable silence that needed no words, because they had long ago learned each other's languages beyond speech. Eleanor's head rested against his shoulder, his fingers tracing slow patterns on her arm, and the library around them held all their history in its walls. The fear and the courage, the books exchanged like confessions, the locked door that had forced truth when politeness would have let them slip past each other into separate lonely futures, and Eleanor found herself thinking about all the people in the world who were hiding as she once hid, seeking sanctuary from judgment and pain, building walls to keep hurt out, but also keeping love at bay. Sebastian kissed the top of her head, a gesture of such casual tenderness that it still made her heart catch even after 3 years of marriage, and she tilted her face up to meet his gaze, those grey eyes that had once seemed so cold, now warm with the firelight, and something deeper, something that had saved them both from their separate isolations. And when he kissed her properly, deeply, it was both familiar and new, the way love renews itself when built on truth rather than illusion. But dear listener, let us step back from Sebastian and Eleanor's happiness for a moment. Let us consider what their story means for those of us who have not yet found our locked doors and the courage to stay when staying seems impossible. Because this is not simply a tale of a duke and a widow in a library during autumn, though it is that too, but a story about the sanctuaries we build to protect ourselves, and the moment when sanctuary must transform into something else or become a prison of our own making. We all hide sometimes, do we not? We all seek refuge from a world that judges too harshly and understands too little, that reduces us to our mistakes and our circumstances and cannot see the complexity beneath the surface. And there is no shame in needing shelter, in finding places where we can breathe without performance or pretense. But here is the truth that Eleanor and Sebastian learned. Sanctuary becomes prison when we forget that safety and stagnation are not the same thing, when we choose invisibility over the terrifying vulnerability of being truly known. Love, real love, the kind that transforms and redeems, requires the courage to unlock the door we have so carefully barred, To let another person see not just the version of ourselves we have carefully curated, but the frightened, flawed, scarred truth beneath. And that is perhaps the most terrifying risk we ever take, because there is no guarantee of acceptance, no promise that the person we reveal ourselves to will choose us rather than our carefully constructed facade. Sometimes the coldest person is simply the most afraid. The most isolated is the one most longing for connection. The most judgmental has judged themselves most harshly. And if we can learn to see past surfaces and reputations to the hidden hearts beneath, we might find that the person we have been avoiding or dismissing is the very one who could understand us best. So, if you find yourself hiding, dear listener, know that your need for sanctuary is valid and human, but ask yourself, is this place of safety still serving you, or has it become a cage? And if someone approaches your locked door, not to force it, but to knock gently and wait, consider the possibility that the greatest courage is not in hiding successfully, but in being seen anyway, in risking rejection for the possibility of genuine connection, in transforming the place you hide into a place you can truly live. May you find your library and your locked door, your moment of choice between safety and love, and may you have the courage to stay when every instinct tells you to flee, because sometimes the ending is really a beginning, sometimes the locked door is not a barrier but an invitation, and sometimes the person on the other side is waiting, has been waiting for you to let them in.